Hello friends, so today's video is going to be a list of some science fiction fantasy standalones I picked up in 2021. I think there's this perception that there aren't very many standalones in science fiction fantasy, but for the past couple of years when I've done these wrap-up style videos at the end of the year or beginning of the next year, I find that I've actually picked up a lot of different standalones, and so I've actually started a playlist with standalone recommendations as well as different book reviews I've done for standalone books. So if you'd like to see a little bit more in-depth, I'll have those linked because I am going to be going through these pretty quick. I have a lot of different books to mention, and hopefully if you're looking for some standalones, some of the ones I mentioned will sound pretty good to you. Kicking off the list, we have Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. You've likely heard me mention this one quite a few different times throughout this year. I read it at the very beginning of 2021, and I quite liked this one. It is a fairy tale retelling, but definitely more on the grim folklore side because it's very bleak, but it's also rooted in our own history, and I think that the way the author incorporates things like fae is more so what you actually would expect from fae folklore type of stories, less so about the A Court of Thorns and Roses type of fae that we tend to see. They're definitely tricksters, they're definitely a lot more brutal, but regardless, the story follows quite a few different main characters, so if you don't like a lot of points of view, this one might be a skip for you. I ultimately really enjoyed a lot of the different perspectives. I will say it was all first person, and you don't get the characters' names whenever you jump to their new perspective. It doesn't tell you. So it's not until you start reading that you pick up on who it is you're following again. But aside from that, I ended up really enjoying this story. It's definitely all about the quiet ways that our characters find power and find their own agency. Really loved so many of the characters. I loved the way the plot was unfolding. Next up, we have The Ones We're Meant to Find. This was in the Goodreads Choice Award nominees, a nominee for YA fantasy, which is not what this is. If anything, this is science fiction, dystopian, and even though it's young adult because the characters are young, I think a lot of the themes and the way that the story is crafted and the writing style, it does not feel young adult to me. It's much more of a thematic story, and it's quite bizarre. So we follow the far future, and you're only picking up bits and pieces of how society is structured now. I'm sorry, my doggy's having a doggy puppy dream, and it's really cute. Similar to, I would say, something like Fahrenheit 451, where you don't get the, here's the breakdown of what everybody is like now and how we got to this point. You sort of just get bits and pieces of modern culture, modern for their time. So I feel in that way it's somewhat similar, although the plot is a little bit different. Because of natural disasters that have been catastrophic, you have a lot of people actually living off the ground, but only so many people can be provided for in these particular areas. And so there are some people who still live on the ground. However, they are often facing a lot of these catastrophic natural disasters. Our main characters are from a prestigious family living off the ground, and one of them has gone missing, and the other one thinks that her missing sister is dead. However, she thinks there's a chance perhaps that she's still alive, and so you're following these two characters trying to get back to each other. And it's not so much a story about these two girls as it is, I think, them representing a lot of various different themes. I can't quite say I loved the book and enjoyed it, had so much fun with it, because it's not that kind of a book. I think it's definitely thought-provoking, so it's not an entertaining read. And that's why I feel it's slightly mismarketed. Next up, we have Never Die. This particular story follows a group of characters who have died, and then there is this young boy who is on a mission, and he ends up recruiting these individuals to help him. These people who have died are among the best warriors. Sometimes they're not actually dead just yet, but the only way that this boy can bend them to their will is if they happen to die, which presents its own issues throughout the book. And this whole story read like an anime. I could see this being made into a one series long show or just a single movie where you're trying to get the band together And then at the end, there's some things that I wasn't quite expecting. Ultimately, I thought this was really fun. It's not something I'll probably return to, but I could definitely see myself picking up something by this author in the future. And if you're looking for an action-packed story, this one is absolutely going to fit it. All of the different warrior type of characters were all very distinct, and the way that the chapters, the action scenes play out is it's a versus sort of situation, and I think that the book definitely knows what it is. It's kind of playing into this almost video game-esque face-off between characters, and so it definitely was very entertaining, opposite, I would say, of the ones we're meant to find. After that, we have Lost in the Neverwoods. This is a Peter Pan retelling following a girl whose two brothers went missing years ago. She went missing as well, but she returned with no memory of what happened to her brothers, and they didn't ever return. And so her and her parents have been dealing with the trauma of this situation, and Peter Pan is not a recognized fairy tale person in their world. It's just somebody her mother has told her stories about. And Wendy, our main character, is finding that she can't stop drawing this individual who looks like Peter Pan. And then this young teenage boy shows up who seems to be Peter Pan, and she thinks there might be clues to finding her missing brothers through him. And this story I had quite a mixed amount of feelings toward, because I enjoyed the beginning. I liked our main character. I liked the family dynamics and the trauma that was explored. And then there was a chunk in the middle where there are children going missing again, and our characters, on top of Wendy trying to find out about her brothers, is also trying to prevent children from going missing. And we kind of dilly-dallied for a while in ways that I found slightly frustrating, but I pushed through to the end, and there's some reveals at the end that I think were very heartbreaking and crafted and executed very well. However, I can see this not being to everybody's liking because of that middle chunk. Next up, we have Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie. I went back and forth between loving Best Served Cold, thinking it was my favorite Abercrombie, and then being kind of a little bit wanting to have it pick up the pace, and then enjoying it again later. I think it's much more plot driven, and it is a classic revenge story. We follow a character who wants revenge on some people who took the life of someone they cared about, as well as sort of ruined her life. As far as revenge stories go, I loved this one. I think it knows what the usual tropes are and plot points that you end up getting with a revenge story. Joe Abercrombie seems very aware of that and leans into it, which I liked. I do kind of think the book could have, for my personal taste, could have been trimmed a little bit, because there were certain things that got a little repetitive for me, but ultimately I really, really liked this one, and I can't wait to read more Abercrombie, which I definitely need to do. Next up is another adult fantasy, and that would be Hall of Smoke. It is somewhat confusing as to whether this is a standalone or not, because on Goodreads there is an additional book set in this world that takes place after the events of this one, and on Goodreads it's listed as the second book, but the author has made clear that this second book is a companion book, and this first book, Hall of Smoke, is a standalone. So this is a somewhat Nordic-inspired fantasy that follows a woman who is grieving. She's a warrior priestess who believes that some of the events that have led to her grief were her own fault for disobeying the goddess that she serves. And so now she is trying to do what she can to right some wrongs, and there's some things that come up along the way that she has to deal with. There's also sort of this mysterious aspect to the story involving the gods and goddesses and just how much power they have. I really like this story. It's kind of a quieter one. I wouldn't say it's particularly action-packed and fun. It's kind of a slower moving story, so probably not something that you pick up if you need a pick-me-up kind of a book, but I ultimately quite enjoyed it, and I do eventually want to read that companion novel. Definitely not a pick-me-up, and a Debbie Downer of a book would be Lancelot. This was so beautifully written. If you are the kind of person that really, really likes beautiful writing, pick up Lancelot. It's not beautiful the way something like Laini Taylor's writing is. It is not whimsical or fairy tale-esque whatsoever. It's just so engrossing and transporting. So Lancelot, as you would guess, is a retelling of the Arthurian legend, but from the perspective of Lancelot. We follow him from the time he's a boy, and it's much more historical fiction feeling, and it's just so beautifully written. I really can't probably overuse that phrase, because it really is. There's just something about it. And if you've read Bloodsong by Anthony Ryan, I've compared these two before. I just think there's something about the slice of life, historical fiction feel that these fantasy stories have that I don't know what it is. It's slow moving, but it's just so captivating. Next up, we have a sci-fi standalone, and that would be Winter's Orbit. While this one does have sort of a murder mystery plot line that pushes the plot forward, I would say the main focus is the trauma that you are diving into for specifically one of the two main characters. So the setup is that we have these two main characters that could not be more unalike, and due to some things in politics, they are being paired together to marry and kind of form an alliance or maintain an alliance. And one of these characters, he's happy-go-lucky, a little mischievous, but he's just always cheerful and wants to have a good time. And then the other character is someone who was previously married and their spouse passed away, and now he is very, very quiet and very reserved, clearly very intelligent, but it would seem that there's something about his relationship with his previous spouse that has impacted him and kind of led him to be very reserved. And so you dive into that. I think it's not the easiest portrayal to read about if you've experienced it before, but I thought it was very, very well executed. And the murder mystery aspect, you know, it made for something to be going on in the background, and it was enjoyable. And I think that the one character being so sweet and nice and happy definitely helped balance out the sadder aspects with the other character. But ultimately, I quite liked it. I don't think this is the sci-fi book if you're a hard sci-fi fan whatsoever, but if you're a character-driven reader, then this one might be one to check out. Next up, we have a young adult standalone, which would be Alotsoe. It's kind of also a murder mystery plotline. And it is young adult, but I almost thought it felt a little bit more middle grade. It dives into some very, very deep themes. The main character is Native American, and there's a lot of Native American aspects to the story, the culture, their history, and I thought the way the author portrayed that in the book was very well done. I do think that this feels to me like middle grade and YA books used to feel when I was younger, because there's a lot of middle grade stories that are actually very heavy and not, they don't sugarcoat things. Something like Number the Stars, I understand, is not a fantasy story necessarily, but something like Number the Stars, that's a book for young people, and it is about something very tragic. So this reminded me in some ways of older middle grade, because I do think that aspects of it felt very young while still having these much heavier themes. But as a result, I don't read a lot of middle grade. And again, it's, from what I can tell, considered young adult. But it felt middle grade-like to me. And I appreciate this story for what it did and for what it is. But I also think that I'm maybe not the target audience for this one. Next up, we have Small Favors. So this is a young adult horror fantasy story. I don't typically read a lot of horror books. I read House of Salt and Sorrows by the same author and had a really good time reading it. My buddy read it with a friend, and it was appropriately creepy and tropey and just such a great random book to pick up on a Friday night, and it's dark and you're like, oh, what's happening? And in Small Favors, I was so surprised because House of Salt and Sorrows definitely had a lot of tropes in it that made it entertaining, but also a little bit more familiar. Whereas this one I thought was, I don't want to say it was a step up, like objectively it was better, but I was really impressed at just how much it seemed more mature than the previous book, and the way the author very slowly gives you the creepy stuff in the story. So we follow a character who is living in this small town village, and everybody knows everybody, and they live on this farm. They're beekeepers, but they also, of course, have crops and things like that to maintain. And just creepy stuff starts happening, and you can't tell sometimes if it's just small town gossip or if somebody really truly did see something horrifying, or why this one group of people who went to go to the neighboring town went missing, why it seems like maybe all of them died, maybe died in violent ways, why is this one person seeing this, why is this little girl have an imaginary friend. There's just all these little creepy things that start happening in the story. And I actually think I didn't 100% love the ending, but I loved everything leading up to it. And I didn't I wasn't unsatisfied by the end. I just think that the setup was what I really liked. The next two are somewhat similar in that they are both retellings of mythology, and that would be Ariadne and The Witch's Heart. Ariadne, to me, it's a Greek story, and I think the author definitely follows the original story pretty well, so the characters are infuriating because they just make the stupidest of decisions sometimes, or their thought process. You're like, why is your brain going there? And they're so frustrating sometimes. But at the same time, it felt like I was getting a novel version of this Greek story. So I kind of respected that it didn't deviate and completely change. There's of course things that are slightly tweaked and the author elaborates on things, otherwise what would even be in the novel. But I actually kind of really liked it, even though I was so annoyed at the characters. It's one of the few times that I've genuinely been like, you're just an idiot at the characters, but then been like, but I kind of like that book. That rarely happens. And then with The Witch's Heart, opposite. This one I really liked, and I really liked our main character, Angrboda, who is Loki's wife, and she is the mother of monsters. I loved her. I loved this character. It's very slow moving, and it kind of resembles what I was referencing with Lancelot, where for a while it's sort of slice of life, and then it dives more into, it definitely gets into the bizarreness that the mythology has, and I quite liked this one. I was very frustrated and bummed out, and I'm like, the gods and goddesses suck. And then by the end, though, I was like, oh, but there's one little detail that like slightly changes my perspective for the rest of the story, and it's definitely one of those books where you're like, because I'm following this character, I view things this way, but by the end, I'm like, oh, if I followed that character instead, would I have viewed this very differently? And I really liked that. Of the two, I definitely enjoyed The Witch's Heart more, but I liked both of them. Next up, we have The Wolf and the Woodsman. This story combines the folklore of different groups of people, and it's kind of inspired by European history. We follow a character who is considered this wolf girl, which is this group of people that kind of live out in the woods, and people think that they're pagans, and they have the ability to see into the future. At least some of the people that live in this village do. And there's also a group of people known as the Woodsman, who every now and then come and take the seer, the person who has the ability to see into the future. They take that woman away from the village, and nobody really knows what happens to these women. Our main character does not have the ability to see into the future. However, the village throws her under the bus, and they say that she does, so they'll take her instead of the real seer, and she kind of has nothing or no one. Where the plot goes from there, it actually ends up getting a lot bigger in scope, and it's definitely one of those people from different backgrounds collide, and they start to recognize that the way I see the world and the way you see the world, we actually have similar things influencing us. It's just these stories from our religion or these stories from our ancestors have been tweaked slightly over generations, and that's why we hate each other, but we shouldn't hate each other. And I just really like stories that explore those sorts of things. There is a romantic aspect to this, and it is kind of an enemies to lovers, and I wouldn't say it overwhelms the other aspects of the story to where it takes over, but it's definitely there, and I can see why some people would not like the particular romance in this story, but I still enjoyed so many other aspects that I enjoyed the book overall. I do think that if you don't like enemies to lovers when they truly are enemies initially, then you will not like the romance between these characters, but I really liked seeing these different worlds colliding and all of the inspirations that made the story what it was. After that, we have Little Thieves. So this is a Goose Girl retelling, and the more I think about this book, the more I liked it, the more I want to reread it. It's a Goose Girl retelling from the antagonist's perspective, and I was not familiar with this original story, so I went into it not knowing anything, and I had such a good time with it. So we follow a character who, she has this magical necklace, that she uses to disguise herself as a noblewoman. You don't really know what happened to the actual noblewoman, but you know our main character seems to have gotten them out of the way so they could take their place. And as this particular noblewoman, they are robbing all the other nobles, and their plan is to eventually get enough money where they can live on their own and be independent and run off and have their own life. They do not want the help of their godmothers, I'll say, who they have been raised by. They want to live independently. However, there is a curse placed on this character basically right at the beginning, and there are also some investigations that seem to be putting her in the spotlight and might end up discovering what she's been up to. So there's so many different things that our character has to navigate and work around and be sneaky and be tricky. And to break the curse, she kind of has to become a better person. It's hard to become a better person when you're trying to trick all these other people and you're still trying to accomplish this goal of yours. I just really, really enjoyed it. I was surprised, too, at the amount of times that it illustrates class issues. So I really liked the way this story played out. I thought it was very fun. It's a YA fairy tale retelling, and I think it feels young adult, but it has some of those slightly more grim fairy tale feelings to it, and I just thought it was a very good time. Next up, we have Under the Whispering Door. This explores the in-between of life and death. We have a man who wasn't all that nice in life and he dies, and then now he is waking up in this in-between, which the whole purpose of the in-between is to help you accept your death and move on to whatever comes after. And this is a story that I think the author put so much time and effort and care into. And it's also a story that I think is very hopeful. However, I have expressed this several times before, but I just don't typically enjoy the in-between kind of plot lines. I think if you take it in a very fantastical direction and it turns out when someone dies, now there's this other kingdom that needs your help or something like that, then I'm down, because then it's just a fantasy book. But when it's basically our world and it's this one person sort of course, metaphorical, thematic, imaginative idea. It's just not a particular type of story that I gravitate towards. I do respect this book so much, and if it sounds like something that you would enjoy, I would definitely say pick it up. It also does not, it's not a very dark approach. It's very whimsical and cheerful and silly, which I think makes it so much easier to take in. Somewhat similar, we have the inheritance of Orquídea Divina. So this follows a matriarch of a family who, at the beginning of the story, she basically lets all of her family members know, hey, I'm about to die, and I need you to come to me so that I can give you your inheritance. And when all these family members come together to visit her, things are very strange, and they don't know what's going on, and they're now trying to puzzle out aspects of her life that affect them. And there's some very, very trippy things happening, not only to her, but to the rest of them at this point, and now they're starting to essentially be in danger. The story is somewhat magical realism, but it starts to become more fantastical as the story progresses. It starts out where you're just like, oh, there's some interesting stuff happening here, I guess. And then it just gets, I would say, pretty much full-on fantasy. But it takes place in our own world and in modern times. And so something about that blend, I just wasn't finding myself clicking with it. There's also so many different characters, and it's not all that long of a book. So it was hard to really feel extremely connected to the characters. Every now and then, Orquídea Divina has her own perspectives from growing up, and that was my favorite part of the story. And I actually kind of wish we could have just seen her life and that be the story, which obviously that's just not what this was. So it was more of a, I kind of wanted to focus in on this one character, and instead we're getting all these other characters and how the legacy of this woman affects them and how her actions have trickled down into her descendants. And I think that all of that was really cool. It just, the way it was done maybe wasn't really for me. However, if it sounds like something that you would enjoy, if you like those multiple generations type of stories, then this one probably will be to your liking. Next book also wasn't quite for me, and that would be The Chosen and the Beautiful. But the reason, I mean, I was pretty sure before I even picked it up, I don't love the original Great Gatsby, and this story is a retelling of the Great Gatsby, and it follows it very, very closely. So there are some fantastical elements, and our main character, who is Jordan, they have tweaked this character to add more depth, not only to them, but to the story as well, the story overall. And I thought that that was very clever. The fantastical elements are sprinkled in here and there. Part of what I think works for a lot of people about The Great Gatsby is it almost seems magical. This level of grandeur seems artificial, and it seems like it can't possibly be quite that exquisite. Where in this one, it's almost like, yeah, it's true. It probably can't be, and maybe there's magic involved. But it doesn't dive that deep into the magic. But there's all these rumors about how Gatsby got his wealth, and so there's a lot of details in that regard. Also, Jordan is a Vietnamese immigrant, but they are a part of upper class society, and the author dives into all the different layers of what it's like to be seen as this exotic oddity within the upper classes, but also not being able to really fit in with a lot of the other immigrants at that time due to the status and the class differences. So I thought they had so much depth with that character. Again, it follows the original so closely, and then I don't love the original. Next up, we have House of Holo. So this was another young adult horror story, and it was very grotesque at times, and I enjoyed it overall. I think something like Small Favors was more to my liking because the character didn't know what was going on in that one. And so you as the reader don't know what's going on. And I like the, oh my gosh, what is going on feeling. And you have, of course, some aspect of that in House of Holo as well. But the main characters seem to be a little bit more familiar with the strangeness that occurs within their lives. So the setup is that we follow these characters, the main character being the youngest sister of these three, and she and her siblings, when they were young, went missing. I know it sounds kind of like Lost in the Neverwoods a little bit, but her and her siblings went missing, and then they came back, and when they came back, it was very disturbing. They were naked and bloody, and one of them was holding a knife, and it became this kind of worldwide phenomenon of what happened to these girls. None of them can remember what happened in the time that they were gone. How they even went missing is a mystery in and of itself, and they've just been kind of trying to get past that and live their lives. It has affected the older two siblings in some pretty intense ways. The younger sibling is just trying to be as normal as possible, but something is happening again, it would seem, and their oldest sister has gone missing, and they're wondering if whatever happened to them as children is going to happen again. The next one would be Jadefire Gold, and I was not sure if this one was a standalone or if it would be getting a sequel. The epilogue definitely leads me to believe it will be getting a sequel. At the time that I was kind of making my lists, though, I hadn't seen anything about a sequel, so I need to check that out again. But if you don't read the epilogue, it seems like it could be a completed story, and it's definitely a characters from opposite sides come together to accomplish a common goal. And I really liked our two different characters. If I had any criticisms about this one, it would just be that I kind of wish that this one book was actually two books, and that we could have taken our time with some things, because there was a lot of buildup at the beginning of the story. And you're kind of getting to know these characters separately. And then once their paths cross, I think things move quite quickly. How the one character intends to get power is definitely rooted in the other character who has power. So you see, are they going to betray each other? Are they going to find out? Are they going to get to know each other and then not be able to go through? Are they going to go through with it anyway? And so there's definitely a lot of those fun enemies to friends, enemies to lovers, that trope. There's definitely a lot of the other aspects you would expect with that trope in this story. But like I said, I do wish it was a little longer. If we do get a sequel, I think I probably will pick it up because I want to see what happens next, and I really appreciated the world building in this story. And I did enjoy this first one overall. That's it for all of the standalones that I read in 2021, unless I'm forgetting one. But either way, I would love to know what standalones you picked up this year, and if any of these sounded like something you would want to try. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.